The old motivation did not leave you all at once. It did not slam the door, announce its departure, or give you one final reason to keep living the way you used to live. It simply stopped answering when you called for it. The same plans that once pulled you forward began to feel strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone whose clothes you had been wearing for many years. You looked at the same work, the same goals, the same promises, the same image of a life that once seemed necessary. And something in you could no longer pretend to be moved by it. At first, this may have frightened you, because a life without the old motivation can feel like a life without a center. You may have wondered why you could no longer push yourself with the same force, why the old urgency had faded, why achievement no longer gave you the same warmth, why pleasing certain people no longer felt noble, only exhausting, why the version of you who could once keep going, no matter how tired, no longer rose from within you on command. It was not laziness that arrived. It was the collapse of an old agreement between your wound and your future. For a long time, motivation may not have been pure desire. It may have been a quiet form of repair. You were not only reaching for success, love, recognition, stability, or belonging. You were trying to answer something that had once gone unanswered in you. You were trying to become undeniable to someone. Even if that someone was no longer in the room, you were trying to build a life so convincing that no old rejection could find you again. And because the effort had meaning, because it gave shape to the pain, it did not feel false while you were inside it. A wound can become a compass when it is not yet understood. It can point you toward the places where you hope to finally be seen. It can turn your loneliness into ambition, your shame into discipline, your abandonment into usefulness, your fear into perfection. From the outside, this may have looked like strength. You may even have been praised for it. You may have been called devoted, resilient, responsible, gifted, deep, generous, mature, dépendable, and perhaps every word was partly true. But beneath the praise, another truth waited quietly. Much of your old movement came from a part of you that still believed it had to earn the right to rest. Then something awakened, not loudly, not as a mystical performance, not as a sudden brightness that made everything clear and easy. More often, awakening begins as an interruption. It is the moment when the psyche can no longer keep feeding energy into a life organized around an unconscious wound. It is the moment when the inner world refuses to keep pretending that compensation is the same as meaning. Through a Jungian lens, one might say, the unconscious had begun withdrawing its approval from the persona you had built. The persona is not a lie in the simple sense. It is the face that helped you meet the world. It allowed you to function, to belong, to survive old rooms, to become acceptable where your real self did not yet feel safe. But when the persona is built too closely around injury, it begins to demand too much of the soul. It asks you to remain impressive when you are grieving. It asks you to remain available when you are empty. It asks you to keep becoming more, because somewhere inside, being enough was never truly allowed to settle into the body. This is why the death of old motivation can feel so confusing. Something that once looked like life force begins to reveal itself as an ancient pressure. You may still care about your life, but you no longer care in the same way. You may still have responsibilities, gifts, and work to do, but the fever behind them has changed. The old inner voice that said, "Keep going or you will disappear," begins to lose its authority. And when that voice grows quiet, you may not immediately hear peace. You may first hear emptiness. There is a strange grief in realizing that some of your dreams were not born from freedom, but from hunger, not because the dreams were worthless, not because what you built had no beauty, but because the one who built them was still trying to be saved by an outcome. You may have wanted a certain life because you believed it would finally prove that you had not been abandoned, underestimated, unseen, replaced, forgotten, or made small. You may have mistaken the future for a witness. You may have thought that if you became successful enough, loved enough, calm enough, wise enough, attractive enough, useful enough, no one would ever again make you feel the way you once felt. And then awakening comes, not to mock the dream, but to separate the soul from the wound that dreamed it. This separation hurts. It can feel like betrayal from within. The very fire that carried you begins to cool, and you stand before your own life like a person entering a familiar house after many years away. The furniture is still there, the table is still set, the window still opens toward the same street. Yet the room no longer feels like proof of who you are. It feels like a place where someone once tried very hard to become safe. Maybe you still wake in the morning and do what must be done. You answer messages, prepare food, meet obligation, speak kindly, perform competence, but somewhere inside, a chair remains empty. The old self who used to sit there, planning, striving, explaining, anticipating, has not returned in the same form. You wait for the familiar pressure to come back, because pressure was once the way you recognized yourself. When it does not come, you may mistake the absence for failure. But sometimes the psyche becomes quiet not because it has lost life, but because it has stopped obeying a wound. This can be deeply unsettling for a mature person, especially one who has built identity around endurance. When you have spent years proving that you can keep moving, stillness feels suspicious. When you have made yourself valuable through effort, a decrease in effort feels like moral danger. When love once depended on what you gave, your body may not know how to interpret a life that asks less from you. So you may accuse yourself, you may call yourself undisciplined. You may wonder whether you have lost your edge. You may fear that awakening has taken something essential from you. But what if it did not take your true motivation? What if it took the motivation that was bound to fear? What if it took the old need to outrun shame? What if it took the hidden bargain that said, "Become extraordinary, and you will never have to feel ordinary pain again"? In the language of the unconscious, this would not be a loss of soul. It would be the soul refusing to keep financing a false emergency. The whole life may have been organized around a promise. One day, you would arrive. One day, you would be secure enough, admired enough, spiritually evolved enough, emotionally healed enough, financially stable enough, needed enough, chosen enough, calm enough. One day, the ache would finally stop, and because the promise was always ahead of you, You kept moving toward it. You learned how to postpone your own tenderness. You learned how to use future achievement as a container for present grief. You learned how to say, not yet, to the part of you that wanted to put everything down. Spiritual awakening interrupts this postponement. It does not always give answers. Sometimes it simply removes the anesthesia. You begin to feel the cost of a life built on proving. You begin to notice how tired your body becomes around goals that once thrilled you. You begin to hear the deadness inside certain conversations, certain ambitions, certain relationships, certain versions of success, not because you have become superior to them, not because you are above ordinary life, but because the old unconscious charge has loosened, and without that charge, many things reveal their true weight. This is why the outside world may misunderstand you. Others may see only that you are less driven, less responsive, less hungry, less willing to chase. They may wonder what happened to your fire. They may miss the version of you who could be counted on to keep striving, keep giving, keep performing desire. They may not know that the fire they admired was partly burning through an old injury. They may not understand that when the wound stops feeding the future must be rediscovered slowly, without violence toward the self. There may be days when you do not know what you want. This is not always because you have no desire. It may be because your desire has been buried beneath years of adaptation. For so long, wanting may have meant wanting what would make you safe, respectable, loved, impressive, or unreachable to pain. Wanting may have been shaped by what others rewarded, what family expected, what the old wound demanded, what the persona could display without trembling. So when awakening loosens the old structure, the question of desire becomes tender and unfamiliar. What do you want when you are no longer trying to repair the past through the future? That question cannot be answered quickly. It has to be approached as one would approach a dark room where a child is sleeping, gently, without forcing the light, without demanding that the hidden self stand up and declare a new purpose immediately. The soul does not always speak in plans. Sometimes it first speaks in refusal. It says, not this, not like this, not for that reason anymore. And although refusal may look empty from the outside, it can be the first honest language the psyche has found in years. You may feel guilty for losing interest in what once defined you. You may feel disloyal to your former self. After all, that self carried you through so much. That self got up when no one noticed the heaviness. That self made things happen. That self learned how to function with a private ache behind the eyes. There is dignity in that old self. There is courage there. Awakening does not need to despise it. In fact, real depth begins when you can look back at that former version with compassion instead of contempt. The old motivation was not stupid. It was intelligent in the way wounded things become intelligent. It learned the emotional economy of your early world. It learned what brought approval, what avoided rejection, what reduced conflict, what created worth, what made you feel briefly safe inside your own skin. If you became ambitious, perhaps ambition gave pain somewhere to go. If you became indispensable, perhaps being needed felt less frightening than being unknown. If you became spiritually disciplined, perhaps spiritual effort gave shape to a loneliness no one had named. The psyche is not random. Even its disguises carry meaning. But meaning is not the same as freedom. Something can save you for a time and still become too small for the whole of your life. A role can protect the injured self and later imprison the emerging self. A dream can carry genuine beauty and still be mixed with old fear. This is the complexity that awakening brings. It does not divide your life into false and true, dark and light, wasted and worthy. It asks you to feel how much of what you called motivation was also mourning. Perhaps there were years when you could not stop. You filled the hours because silence would have brought you too close to what had never been grieved. You chased improvement because stillness threatened to reveal how unloved you had felt in places where love should have been simple. You kept becoming more capable because needing anything from anyone had once been humiliating, unsafe, or unanswered. You made yourself strong, not because strength was your only nature, but because softness had nowhere to land. And now, after awakening, softness begins to return in strange forms, not as sweetness necessarily. Sometimes it returns as fatigue, sometimes as disinterest, sometimes as tears at inconvenient moments, sometimes as a quiet inability to keep lying to yourself, sometimes as a lack of excitement where you expected pride. The body, long trained to carry the old life, begins to question the burden. You may feel it in the chest before you can name it in the mind. A small tightening when you agree to something you no longer mean. A heaviness when you imagine continuing for another 10 years as the same person. A silence in the stomach when someone praises the version of you that cost too much to maintain. This is not the end of purpose, but it may be the end of purpose as compensation, and that ending can feel like a small death. The ego, which had organized itself around direction, does not easily accept the loss of its old map. It wants another plan immediately. It wants a cleaner identity. It wants to turn awakening into a new performance, a new title, a new certainty. But the deeper psyche moves more slowly. It does not rush to replace one mask with another. It may leave you for a while in the hallway between rooms, where the old door has closed and the new one has not yet opened. That hallway is not punishment. It is the place where the unconscious stops being useful and starts being truthful. You may stand there with no applause, no clear ambition, no familiar urgency, and feel almost ashamed of your quietness. Yet something sacred may be happening there, though not in a grand way. The part of you that was always running ahead, trying to secure love before it could be withdrawn, is finally being asked to come back into the present, not to be fixed, not to be improved, just to be found. The awakening that kills old motivation often reveals an old sorrow beneath it, a sorrow that says, I tried so hard to become someone who would never be left. I tried so hard to become someone whose value could not be questioned. I tried so hard to make a life that would silence the old ache. And when this sorrow rises, the task is not to argue with it. The task is to let it be heard without turning it into another project. Some grief does not need a solution. It needs a witness spacious enough not to hurry it. This may be why you feel slower now, not because life has left you, but because truth has weight. You are no longer carried by the same unconscious wind. You are beginning to notice the difference between movement and flight, between devotion and self-erasure, between purpose and pressure, between love and performance. between being alive and being driven by the fear that you are not enough unless something outside you confirms it. There is a kind of motivation that comes from exile. It says, become more, so you will not have to feel what was missing. But there is another kind that comes from belonging to yourself. That second kind is quieter. It does not usually arrive immediately after awakening. First, the old engines cool. First, the body stops lending itself to old emergencies. First, the persona loses some of its shine. First, the room becomes quiet enough for the real self to be sensed, not as a triumphant figure, but as something small, passion, and long neglected. So if you cannot feel the old hunger, perhaps do not rush to condemn the silence. The silence may be carrying information that effort used to drown out. It may be telling you that the life you built was not meaningless, but it cannot be the whole truth anymore. It may be telling you that the one who worked so hard has grown tired of being mistaken for the whole person. It may be telling you that the wound has lost some of its authority, and now the soul must learn a different way to move. For now, there may only be the chair, the window, the quiet room, and the strange absence of the old command. There may only be the realization that you are not who you were when fear was still the architect of your future. There may only be the ache of not knowing what comes next, and the tenderness of recognizing how long you lived, as if love had to be earned through becoming. That recognition may not give you energy immediately. It may first ask you to sit down inside your own life and tell the truth. The old motivation died where the old wound stopped giving orders. The old motivation died where the old wound stopped giving orders. And after that, what remained may have looked strangely unimpressive from the outside. No sudden clarity, no new mission descending fully formed, no great announcement from the soul, only a kind of inward quiet, almost embarrassing in its simplicity, as if something in you had stepped away from the machinery and could not explain why it no longer wished to return. You may have tried to restart yourself. You may have reached for the old rituals of pressure, comparison, planning, spiritual discipline, ambition, responsibility, or fear. You may have reminded yourself of everything you once wanted, everything you once promised, everything you still needed to become, but the words did not land with the same force. They moved across the surface of you like rain on a window. You understood them, but they no longer entered the blood. Something in you had become unavailable to the old command. This is one of the loneliest parts of awakening, because it can make you feel ungrateful toward your own life. You may look at what you have, what you built, what you hoped for, what others still admire, and feel a strange distance. You do not necessarily hate it. You may even still care for it, but the old enchantment is gone. The promise that once lived inside it has withdrawn, and when the promise leaves, the thing itself becomes visible without its spell. That visibility can be painful. A career may become just a career. A relationship may become just a relationship. A role may become just a role. A spiritual identity may become just another way the ego learned to dress itself in meaning. This does not mean everything is false. It means the unconscious has stopped allowing you to confuse symbolic compensation with the living self. In Jungian terms, the self is not the image you present, not the role that wins approval, not the healed identity you can explain. It is the deeper center that does not need to perform in order to exist. But before that center can be felt, the old center has to lose its throne. And the old center was often built from a complex. A complex is not merely a memory, it is a living cluster in the psyche, carrying emotion, image, expectation, fear, and old unfinished experience. When a complex is touched, it does not feel like the past. It feels like now. It speaks with urgency. It says, prove yourself now, please them now, avoid rejection now, do not disappoint them now, become more now, be strong now, be useful now. And for years, you may have mistaken the voice of that complex for your own will. This is why the loss of motivation can feel so much like losing yourself. The complex had been borrowing your life force. It had woven itself into your goals, your goodness, your productivity, your longing, your spirituality, even your idea of love. It did not always harm you in obvious ways. Sometimes it gave you direction, sometimes it helped you endure, sometimes it pushed you toward remarkable achievements. But it kept one hidden condition at the center. You were allowed to move forward. As long as you did not stop long enough to feel what was underneath. Spiritual awakening often begins when that condition fails. The psyche grows tired of paying for identity with avoidance. It grows tired of building meaning on top of unacknowledged grief. It grows tired of asking the body to keep carrying what the heart has never been permitted to mourn. So the old motivation weakens, not because you have become empty, but because a deeper truth can no longer be fed by an old fear. The unconscious removes energy from the false arrangement. It does this quietly at first, then insistently, then in ways you can no longer ignore. You may have noticed that certain ambitions began to feel strangely theatrical. The words sounded right, but your body did not rise to meet them. The image of being admired, chosen, successful, spiritually advanced, indispensable, or finally understood may once have filled you with fire. Now it may feel like standing before a mirror that no longer reflects anything alive. The mirror is still there. You can still see the outline, but the soul is no longer willing to live inside the reflection. This is where the persona begins to crack, not as a dramatic breakdown, but as a quiet refusal to keep representing a self that has outlived its inner necessity. The persona once helped you. It gave you a way to face the world when your private self did not feel safe enough to arrive unguarded. It allowed you to be competent when you were wounded, polite when you were grieving, responsible when you were frightened, generous when you were lonely, calm when something in you was shaking. But the longer the persona is mistaken for the whole person, the more life becomes a performance of adaptation. And the adapted self can be very successful. It can appear wise, kind, steady, productive, spiritual, self-contained. It can become the one others rely on. It can become the one who never asks too much. It can become the one who is praised for being easy to love because their need has been hidden so thoroughly. Yet beneath this surface, the rejected self waits. The unlived self waits. The self who was never allowed to want without guilt, rest without earning it, speak without managing the room, or belong without proving usefulness. When awakening enters, it does not always feel like light. Sometimes it feels like the return of the rejected self, and the rejected self does not first arrive as confidence. It arrives as interruption, it arrives as fatigue, refusal, sadness, irritation, numbness, longing, confusion. It arrives as a strange inability to enjoy what once distracted you from yourself. It arrives as a heaviness near the chest when you imagine continuing in the same direction with the same smile. It arrives as the quiet sentence you do not want to hear. I cannot keep becoming this person for reasons that no longer feel true. There is a tenderness in this, though it may not feel tender at first. Something in you is trying to stop the old abandonment from continuing inwardly. For years, the outer world may have abandoned certain parts of you, or failed to meet them, or rewarded you only when they were hidden. But later, without meaning to, you may have continued the same pattern inside yourself. You may have abandoned your own stillness in order to be productive, abandoned your own grief in order to be pleasant, abandoned your own desire in order to be acceptable, abandoned your own pace in order to remain impressive. The old motivation helped you do this. It gave the abandonment a noble face. It said, keep going, this is strength. It said, become more, this is purpose. It said, do not need so much, this is maturity. It said, forgive quickly, give generously, work harder, stay composed, be above it, be useful, be the one who understands. And perhaps there was truth inside some of those movements, but a truth used to hide another truth becomes a burden. A virtue pressed into service by fear begins to lose its warmth. From a depth psychology perspective, the psyche seeks wholeness more than approval, but the ego often seeks approval because approval once felt like safety. This creates the conflict you may now be living. The older part of you still remembers the emotional world where being liked, needed, admired, or indispensable mattered deeply. The deeper self is no longer satisfied by those currencies. It asks for something more difficult and less visible. It asks for honesty. It asks for inner alignment. It asks you to stop using your life to negotiate with ghosts. These ghosts do not have to be literal. They may be the old parental gaze within you, the family atmosphere you still carry in your nervous system, the early room where love was conditional, distracted, unstable, ashamed, demanding, or emotionally absent, the old table where your place was secured by being quiet, helpful, exceptional, entertaining, undemanding, or strong. Even now, you may carry that table inside you. You may still imagine unseen figures sitting there, watching what you become, deciding whether you have done enough to deserve warmth. And so your old motivation may have been secretly relational. You were not merely trying to achieve, you were trying to be answered. You were trying to finally win the gaze that never rested on you with enough tenderness. You were trying to create a life that would force recognition from the very place that once withheld it. Even if the people are gone, even if the situation changed long ago, the complex may keep repeating the emotional scene. It keeps arranging new stages for the old longing. It keeps saying, perhaps this time, if you become enough, the room will change. But Awakening reveals something devastating and merciful. The old room does not change because you become impressive inside it. The old room changes when you stop living as though it still has the authority to name you. This is not rebellion in the shallow sense. It is a withdrawal of psychic obedience. You begin to feel that you can no longer spend your life asking an inner absence to become love. You can no longer offer your future as proof to a past that cannot bless you. You can no longer remain seated at a table where your soul is fed only by performance. This recognition can kill motivation because so much of your energy was tied to that invisible table. You may have thought you were moving toward success, but part of you was moving toward vindication. You may have thought you wanted admiration, but part of you wanted a wound to be contradicted. You may have thought you wanted peace, but part of you wanted the world to apologize without having to ask. When awakening exposes the hidden audience, the performance loses force, the stage lights dim. The applause, even when it comes, sounds far away. There is grief in this, because the old arrangement kept you company. Even pressure can become familiar company. Even striving can feel like a hand to hold when stillness is too exposed. When the old command fades, you may feel deserted by the very thing that once helped you bear life. It is possible to miss the urgency that hurt you. It is possible to miss the version of yourself who always knew what to do. Because not knowing feels like standing at a window at night, looking out into a world that no longer reflects your former identity. Do not rush past that grief. The old self deserves to be mourned, not worshipped, not restored, but mourned. That self got you through rooms where your real feelings had no safe chair. That self learned the language of expectation. That self found ways to matter. That self made something out of pressure, because pressure was what life gave them. If you feel tenderness for that old version, it does not mean you are going backward. It means the psyche is becoming spacious enough to hold its own history without hatred. In Jungian language, this is part of individuation, not becoming a better version of the persona, but becoming more whole than the persona allowed. Individuation is not the ego improving its image. It is the slow, often painful encounter with what has been excluded. And when the excluded parts return, they disturb the old direction. The part of you that was tired returns. The part that was angry returns. The part that wanted beauty without earning it returns. The part that did not want to be useful all the time returns. The part that longed to be loved without becoming exceptional returns. These returning parts do not always speak politely. They may first appear as resistance. They may make you forget why you once cared so much. They may make certain obligations feel heavier than before. They may bring dreams of houses with locked rooms, hallways without exits, old chairs covered in dust, windows that open onto unfamiliar landscapes. The psyche may present an image of the life you have inhabited, and within that image, a room you have not entered, not because it was forbidden forever, but because the old motivation kept you too busy to notice the door. That door may frighten you. Behind it is not a grand new identity. Behind it may be grief, desire, anger, innocence, play, hunger, softness, and a kind of quiet that does not know how to impress anyone. Behind it may be the life you did not live because you were too occupied becoming acceptable. Behind it may be the person who stopped speaking when the role became necessary. This is why the loss of motivation is not simply psychological fatigue. It is a summons from the unlived life. The unlived life does not always announce itself through fantasy. Sometimes it appears through the dullness of the overlived life. It lets you feel how much of your time has been spent maintaining a self that others understood more easily than you did. It lets you feel the cost of repeating the same emotional pattern in more adult forms. It lets you feel the difference between a life that functions and a life that belongs to you. This difference can ache deeply, especially when you realize how long you have been faithful to something that was never truly yours. Yet awakening does not ask you to throw away everything. That would be another drama of the ego, another attempt to create certainty through reversal. The deeper movement is more subtle. It asks you to listen for where energy still lives when fear is not driving. It asks you to notice what remains meaningful when no one is watching. It asks you to feel which parts of your old life can be inhabited honestly, and which parts were kept alive only by the need to prove, please, repair, or escape. This is slow work, though it is not work in the ordinary sense. It is more like waiting for water to clear after years of being stirred by urgency. At first, you may see very little. You may only know what you cannot continue. You may only feel the absence of the old push. You may only sit by the window of your own life, unsure whether the quiet outside is emptiness or invitation. But the fact that you no longer respond to the old pressure is already a kind of truth. It means something in you has begun to distinguish between the voice of the wound and the voice of the self. The wound speaks in emergency, the self speaks in depth. The wound says, hurry, become, prove, secure, prevent. The self often says almost nothing at first. It does not compete with fear by becoming louder than fear. It waits. It appears in small moments of honesty, in the relief that comes after saying no inwardly, in the unexpected sadness that feels clean, in the simple desire to sit without performing readiness. It appears when you no longer need every feeling to become useful. It appears when you can let the old ache exist without building an empire around it. This may be what the old life could not allow. The old life needed you directed, recognizable, productive, spiritually composed, emotionally available, or morally certain. It needed you to keep moving because movement kept certain questions away. Who am I when I am not earning love? Who am I when I am not repairing the past? Who am I when no one needs my strength? Who am I when the old wound is no longer allowed to design my future? These questions do not arrive to punish you. They arrive because the soul has become tired of living under an inherited script. There may be an unexpected tenderness in discovering that you are not unmotivated in the way you feared. You are no longer enchanted by the same bargain. That is different. Your life force has not disappeared. It has withdrawn from places where it was being used against your own wholeness. It has retreated from performances that once won approval but cost you inward truth. It has gone quiet, like an animal that has been handled too roughly and now waits to see whether the room is safe. You cannot drag it back by force, and perhaps that is the humbling part. The old method was force. Push harder, think better, become disciplined, shame yourself into motion. Fear the consequences. Imagine being left behind. Compare yourself. Promise yourself that everything will feel better once you arrive. But awakening makes these methods feel more and more foreign. They may still work for a moment, but they leave a bitter taste. They move the body while the soul stays seated. This is why the body becomes such an honest witness. It may not argue, it may not give you a philosophy, it simply refuses to brighten around certain old futures. It tightens when the persona starts speaking too quickly. It grows heavy when you agree to carry a role that no longer belongs to you. It becomes tired in the presence of ambitions that once glittered. The body is not betraying you, it is remembering the cost of all the years when you called self-abandonment responsibility. And still, you may need to live, you may need to work, care, decide, provide, answer, show up. Awakening does not remove ordinary reality. It changes the inner arrangement beneath it. You may continue many outward things for a time, but inwardly, the old devotion to the wound begins to loosen. You may do what must be done, but with less worship of the role. You may keep the house standing, but stop believing the house is your soul. You may sit at the table, but no longer wait for it to tell you who you are. This is a quiet revolution, and because it is quiet, others may not know how much has changed. They may see the same face, the same hands, the same routine. They may not see that the inner audience has begun to disappear. They may not see that you are no longer performing for the old room. They may not see that the future you once chased has lost its power because it was never only a future. It was a petition. It was a plea for something to be undone. And once you see this, you cannot fully unsee it. You may still feel pulled by old habits. You may still feel guilt, fear, longing, or the ache of unfinished recognition. But something has shifted. The motivation behind your old life has been named, and once named, it cannot rule with the same invisibility. What once felt like destiny begins to look like adaptation. What once felt like ambition begins to reveal its grief. What once felt like love begins to show the places where fear taught you to offer yourself too quickly. The window remains, the chair remains, the room remains, but you are no longer standing in it as the same person. The old wound may still speak, but its voice comes from farther away now. You can hear it without becoming it completely, and in that small distance, painful as it is, something begins that is not driven, not dramatic, not yet clear. It is the first fragile space where a different life could one day breathe without having to prove why it deserves to exist. The old life did not lose meaning. It lost the hidden fear that made it unquestionable. The old life did not lose meaning. It lost the hidden fear that made it unquestionable. And when that fear loosened, you may have found yourself looking at everything with a strange new distance. Not coldly, not with arrogance, but with the sadness of someone who has finally seen the price beneath the beautiful surface. You may have seen how much of your energy had gone into keeping the old story alive. How much of your hope had been tied to being recognized by what could never truly recognize you. How much of your goodness had been shaped around the belief that if you stopped giving, stopped achieving, stopped proving, something essential would be taken away. This is where awakening becomes more difficult than the language around it often admits. It is not only light, it is not only peace, it is not only the gentle return to yourself, it is also the moment when the psyche asks you to look at the bargain that carried you, not to shame you, not to accuse you, not to make your past smaller, but to let you see how the old role did not merely happen to you. At some point, it also began to serve you, quietly, tenderly, painfully, in ways your conscious mind may not have wanted to know. Perhaps being needed gave you a place at the table. Perhaps being useful made you harder to abandon. Perhaps being impressive protected you from the old humiliation of feeling ordinary, unseen, or easy to forget. Perhaps being spiritually mature allowed you to rise above anger before you had to feel how much anger was actually there. Perhaps being calm made you safe in rooms where other people's emotions had once filled the air like weather. Perhaps being the one who understood everyone else allowed you to avoid the more frightening question of whether anyone truly understood you. This is the shadow moment, though it does not need to be harsh. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not simply what is bad. It is what has been left outside the image you could afford to show. And for someone who built a life around goodness, endurance, maturity, or spiritual seriousness, the shadow may contain not cruelty, but need. It may contain resentment. It may contain the wish to be chosen without being useful. It may contain the wish to stop caring so deeply what happens to everyone else. It may contain the quiet grief of having made yourself necessary because being freely loved did not feel available. The role paid you in a currency you could not refuse. It paid you with belonging, with identity, with relief from helplessness, with the feeling that your presence mattered. If you were the strong one, you did not have to feel how alone you were. If you were the wise one, you did not have to feel how confused and wounded you remained. If you were the giving one, you did not have to face the terror of asking. If you were the awakened one, you did not have to admit that some parts of you were still waiting in the dark. Not enlightened, not peaceful, simply hurt. There is no blame in this. The psyche chooses what keeps it together. A child does not sit down and design a false self with full understanding. A young person does not consciously decide to turn longing into achievement, fear into responsibility, shame into perfection, loneliness into spiritual searching. These things grow gradually, like vines around a house. At first, they protect the walls from wind. Later, they cover the windows. You may have lived many years inside that house, grateful for its shelter, not yet knowing how little light was coming through. When awakening arrives, the vines are not torn away all at once. You begin to notice them. You begin to see that the very thing that once protected you is now darkening the rooms. You begin to feel how the old motivation kept you from certain forms of despair, but also from certain forms of life. It helped you move, but it also kept you moving past yourself. It gave you a direction, but it also narrowed your sense of what was possible. It made you strong, but perhaps it made softness feel like danger. It made you capable, but perhaps it made being cared for feel almost unreal. This is why spiritual awakening can feel like losing the self you trusted. The part of you that knew how to function was bound to a hidden survival of meaning. It knew how to earn warmth. It knew how to create value. It knew how to read the room. It knew how to turn pain into productivity before anyone could see the wound. It knew how to stand beside the window at night and promise itself that someday the ache would be explained by the life you had built. But the awakened psyche can no longer live only on explanations. It wants contact with what is real. And what is real may not flatter you at first. It may show you that some of your compassion carried resentment, that some of your loyalty carried fear, that some of your discipline carried self-punishment, that some of your spiritual devotion carried a wish to escape the ordinary grief of being human, that some of your longing for purpose was also a longing not to feel empty. These recognitions can be painful because they touch the places where you tried to be pure. But wholeness does not ask you to be pure. It asks you to stop exiling the parts of yourself that made purity necessary. The old life may have required you to divide yourself. On one side, the acceptable one, the patient one, the improving one, the one who did not complain, the one who knew how to make meaning out of pain. On the other side, the tired one, the angry one, the needy one, the one who wanted to be held without becoming wise about it, the one who did not want to transform every wound into a teaching, the one who wanted to say, "This hurt me," and have that be enough. When motivation dies after awakening, it may be because the acceptable one can no longer keep all the rejected ones outside the door. They have begun to return. They stand in the hallway of the psyche, not as enemies, but as exiles who have waited too long, and they may not be interested in your old goals. They may not care whether you are admired. They may not care whether you remain impressive. They may not care whether you keep the peace in every room. They want something simpler and harder. They want to exist without being turned immediately into usefulness. This is a difficult mercy, because once the rejected self returns, the old persona cannot fully convince you anymore. You may still use it, you may still need it in ordinary life, but you know it is not the whole truth. You feel the difference between the smile that belongs to kindness and the smile that belongs to fear. You feel the difference between service that comes from love and service that comes from the old bargain. You feel the difference between effort that expresses life and effort that tries to purchase the right to rest. That difference changes everything, even if nothing outward changes quickly. Perhaps this is why you have felt less available to certain ambitions. Certain people, certaines promises. It is not because you have become empty of love. It is because love and fear are beginning to separate. For years, they may have been woven together so tightly that you could not tell where devotion ended and anxiety began. You may have called it care when it was also vigilance. You may have called it purpose when it was also compensation. You may have called it generosity when it was also the hope that giving enough would protect you from being left alone with your own longing. To see this is not to condemn yourself. It is to bring light into the place where the old wound negotiated with the world on your behalf. And when that negotiation is seen, its power weakens. The voice that once said, "Do more or you will not matter," begins to sound less like truth and more like an echo. The voice that said, "Become extraordinary or you will be forgotten," begins to reveal its childish fear. The voice that said, "Never need too much," begins to tremble with the memory of unanswered need. You do not have to silence these voices violently. You only have to hear their age. There may be a very young part of you inside the old motivation, a part that still stands at the inner table waiting for someone to look up, waiting for someone to say, "Yes, I see what you carried. Yes, I know you tried. Yes, you can stop proving now." But because that sentence did not come when it was most needed, the psyche tried to create it through the future. It built achievements, rôle, responsibilities, spiritual identities, forms of competence. It tried to make the world speak the missing words. And every time the world failed to speak them fully, you may have raised the standard again. This is why no accomplishment could completely quiet the ache. It could soothe it briefly. It could cover it. It could give you evidence against the old wound. But evidence is not the same as healing. The wound was never only asking for proof. It was asking for presence. It was asking to be felt without being converted into improvement. It was asking for the part of you who kept running to finally turn around and come home. Spiritual awakening often begins precisely there, when the runner becomes too tired to keep mistaking motion for return. One might say, in the language of the unconscious, that the energy has withdrawn from the outer object because the inner figure is asking to be met. The goal, the role, the approval, the dream, the recognition, the future all lose some of their charge because the psyche is redirecting attention toward what had been abandoned inside. This redirection does not feel efficient. It may feel like slowing down when you should be moving. It may feel like losing your old self at the very moment you expected to become more whole. But the self does not always begin by giving you more energy. Sometimes it begins by taking energy away from what is false enough to keep you divided. You may notice this most clearly in how your body responds to the old path. The body may become quiet, heavy, resistant, not dramatically, not as a message you can easily translate, but as a refusal to participate with the same innocence. A certain email, a certain request, a certain plan, a certain conversation about the future may bring a dullness you cannot argue away. It is as if the body remembers every time you called self-abandonment discipline. It remembers every yes that was actually a small disappearance. It remembers every season when you praised yourself for carrying more than your soul could bless. And yet, the body is not trying to end your life as you know it. It is trying to return your life to you. This distinction matters. The old wound hears refusal and thinks everything will be lost. The deeper psyche hears refusal and recognizes a boundary around the sacred. You may still continue certain responsibilities, but now you begin to feel where the soul withdraws. You begin to sense where your presence is genuine and where it has become a costume. You begin to know, not as an idea, but as an inward ache, that you cannot keep spending yourself in places where only your function is loved. The function may have been loved for a long time. Your strength, your listening, your stability, your wisdom, your patience, your ability to recover quickly, forgive quietly, manage yourself, carry the atmosphere, anticipate the needs of the room. These functions may have made you cherished in certain systems, but being cherished as a function is not the same as being met as a person. The difference can take half a lifetime to feel, and when you finally feel it, the old motivation behind being functional begins to fade. You cannot unknow the loneliness of being valued for what protects others from having to know you. This is a deep sorrow. Let it be deep. Do not make it smaller by rushing to call it freedom. There is grief in realizing that the version of you most praised may have been the version most separated from your own need. There is grief in realizing that what others called your gift may also have been the wound's intelligence. There is grief in realizing that the old life did not only fail you, it also loved you in the only way it knew how. It gave you a structure. It gave you something to become. It gave your pain a direction when direct grieving was not yet possible. So perhaps the old life deserves neither rejection nor return. It deserves a funeral without hatred. It deserves a candle in the window. It deserves the dignity of being understood as a house you once needed. Even if you can no longer live in all its rooms, you do not have to burn the table where the old self waited for recognition. But you may need to stop sitting there every night, hoping the same absent gaze will finally become tender. You may need to stand up gently, not with triumph, but with the tired honesty of someone who knows the meal being served there has never truly fed them. This standing up may not look heroic. It may look like losing interest. It may look like not replying as quickly. It may look like needing more silence than before. It may look like feeling strangely unmotivated by praise. It may look like becoming less willing to explain your inner weather. It may look like disappointing the part of you that still believes love must be maintained through effort. But beneath these small changes, something profound is occurring. The old economy of the psyche is being revised. The role that paid you with belonging now costs too much life. The achievements that paid you with evidence now no longer soothe the original ache. The persona that paid you with safety now keeps you too far from your own warmth. The spiritual identity that paid you with meaning now may ask too much distance from your ordinary human grief. And so the soul begins to reclaim its energy, coin by coin, breath by breath, refusal by refusal. It does not do this to leave you poor. It does this so your life is no longer funded by self-estrangement. There may be fear here, because without the old economy, you do not yet know what will sustain you. If you are not driven by fear, what will move you? If you are not needed, what will connect you? If you are not proving, what will give your days shape? If you are not becoming more, what will make you worthy of staying? These questions can feel unbearable because they expose how deeply worth became tied to movement. But they are also honest questions. They are the first questions that do not kneel before the old wound. The shadow does not disappear when seen. It becomes related to. This is important. You may still feel the pull to become indispensable. You may still feel the old thrill of being admired for strength. You may still feel the temptation to turn awakening into another identity that keeps pain at a distance. You may still want to be above wanting. These things may visit you, but now, perhaps, you can meet them with a little more tenderness. You can say, I know why you came. I know what you protected. I know the room you were born in. And when you can speak inwardly in this way, something softens. Not everything, not permanently, but enough for the rejected self to breathe. Enough for the old pressure to lose a little of its holiness. Enough for the chair by the window to become a place of listening rather than punishment. You may sit there and feel no great purpose, no dramatic certainty, no clear vision, and yet, perhaps for the first time, the absence of urgency does not have to mean the absence of life. It can mean that life is no longer willing to be driven by panic, dressed as destiny. This is not the same as giving up. Giving up belongs to despair. This is more like a sacred fatigue that tells the truth. The soul is tired of translating abandonment into ambition, tired of translating loneliness into usefulness, tired of translating shame into perfection, tired of translating spiritual hunger into another form of self-demand. It has carried these translations for so long that the original language of the self may feel almost forgotten. And now, slowly, awkwardly, painfully, that original language begins to return. It may return as a preference you never allowed, a boundary you do not justify, a sadness you do not decorate, a small desire that has nothing to do with proving anything, a quiet morning that does not need to become productive immediately, a moment of looking out the window and not asking what this feeling can be used for. These are not small things. They are signs that the psyche is beginning to trust existence without constant performance. They are the first words of a self that was not built merely to answer the wound. Still, there will be mourning. You may mourn the years spent chasing a future that was secretly shaped by the past. You may mourn the love you tried to earn from people, systems, or inner images that could not meet you. You may mourn the version of yourself who believed that rest had to be postponed until every debt of worthiness had been paid. You may mourn how long it took to understand that you were not lazy when you lost motivation. You were grieving the collapse of an old psychic contract. That contract may have said, "If I become enough, I will finally feel safe. If I give enough, I will finally be loved. If I understand enough, I will not be hurt by what others cannot give. If I awaken enough, I will rise beyond needing anything." But the contract was written by a wounded part of you. It was never meant to govern an entire life. It helped you cross certain nights. It helped you keep breathing when direct truth was too much. But now the hand that signed it is older. The soul that once accepted its terms has begun to read the fine print. And what it sees is this: the old motivation asked you to postpone yourself. It asked you to become meaningful before being allowed to feel. It asked you to be healed before being human. It asked you to turn every ache into a project, every longing into a discipline, every silence into an achievement. No wonder something in you finally grew tired. No wonder the old fire cooled. A fire that burns only to keep grief from speaking cannot warm the whole house forever. So when you feel the emptiness where motivation used to be, perhaps you are feeling the space left by an old command. That space may ache. It may feel too quiet. It may make you wonder whether anything real will ever rise there. But emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is what remains after the false urgency has left the room. Sometimes it is the clear table after years of serving a hunger that was not yours alone. Sometimes it is the dark soil before desire returns in a form that does not require self-betrayal. You are not being asked to know the new life yet. You are being asked to stop lying about the old one. That is already a great deal. It is enough to let the old motivation be seen not as failure, not as weakness, not as something to resurrect by force, but as a structure that had completed its service. It carried the wound forward until the wound could be recognized. It gave motion to the ache until the ache could be held. It kept you moving until movement was no longer the same as life. The room is quieter now. The old table is still there, but it does not command the same obedience. The window is still dark, but it no longer shows only the reflection of the person you had to become. Somewhere behind you, a door you barely noticed has begun to loosen in its frame. You do not have to open it yet. You do not have to name what is behind it. It is enough that the whole house no longer belongs to the wound. The old bargain was seen, and its silence began to break. The old bargain was seen, and its silence began to break. Not loudly, not with a declaration strong enough to impress the world, but with the soft fracture of something that had been held together for too long by obedience. You may have expected that seeing the truth would immediately free you. Instead, it may have made you more tender, more uncertain, less able to move with the old confidence. Truth does not always arrive as power. Sometimes it arrives as the end of an illusion you had depended on for warmth. This is why the final movement of awakening is often quieter than the beginning. At first, recognition may feel almost sharp. You see the pattern. You see the wound beneath the ambition. You see the old role beneath the devotion. You see how much of your motivation was built from the hope that one day someone or something would finally answer the ache. But after the seeing comes a more difficult task. Though task is almost too strong a word. You must learn how to remain with your life after the old spell has gone. Remaining is not passive. It may be the first honest act. For years, movement helped you avoid the full weight of your own presence. Striving kept the old questions moving ahead of you. Responsibility kept you occupied. Improvement gave pain a direction. Spiritual seeking gave the wound a higher language. But now, the soul no longer wants to run everything through purpose before it is allowed to feel. It wants to sit in the room without proving why it deserves to be there. There may be no dramatic transformation waiting at the door. There may be dishes in the sink, messages unanswered, work still unfinished, bodies that age, bills that return, relationships that remain complicated, mornings that do not feel radiant. Awakening does not lift you out of ordinary life. It brings the unconscious into ordinary life. It lets you stand at the window and feel both the sorrow of what was lost and the quiet dignity of not having to turn that sorrow into another performance. This is where the old motivation finally begins to be understood, not as an enemy, but as a former servant. It served the wound, it also served the child, the younger self, the frightened self, the self who did not yet know how to live without proving. It carried you when you had no other way to carry yourself. It gave you direction when direct grief would have overwhelmed you. It helped you become capable in a world where tenderness had not always been reliable. To condemn it completely would be to condemn the part of you that used whatever was available to keep going. And yet, gratitude does not require return. You can honor what carried you without kneeling before it again. You can recognize the intelligence of the old persona without letting it govern the whole house. You can feel compassion for the self who was driven by fear without allowing fear to remain the architect of your future. This is a delicate separation. It does not happen once. It happens in small moments. When the old command rises and you do not immediately obey, when praise comes and you notice that it no longer feeds the deepest hunger, when guilt knocks at the door and you do not mistake it for truth, from a Jungian perspective, this is the slow work of becoming more whole. Wholeness does not mean that every wound closes. It means fewer parts of the psyche are forced into exile in order for the visible self to remain acceptable. It means the tired part, the angry part, the longing part, the ordinary part, the part that never wanted to be exceptional, can all begin to have a place at the inner table, not to take over, not to destroy what you built, but to end the old monarchy of the role that claimed to speak for all of you. You may notice that your life becomes less easy to explain. The old story was simple. I am working hard because I have goals. I am giving because I love. I am improving because I want to grow. I am spiritual because I seek truth. I am responsible because that is who I am. There may still be truth in these sentences, but now you hear the silence around them. You hear the question beneath them. You know that every noble sentence can hide a smaller frightened one. Please do not leave me. Please see me. Please say I have done enough. Please let my life prove that the old wound was wrong. When those smaller sentences become audible, they deserve mercy. They are not shameful. They are human. They come from the place where the psyche tried to continue loving itself after love had become uncertain. They come from the place where a young self learned to trade ease for belonging, need for competence, rest for approval, spontaneity for control. If you listen deeply enough, even the old pressure becomes sad rather than cruel. It was trying to protect you from the terror of being no one in a room where someone should have known your name. But you are not in that room in the same way now. Even if traces of it remain inside you, even if certain voices still echo, even if the body still tenses before rejection has arrived, something has shifted. The old table no longer has the same authority. The old audience is no longer as convincing. The old dream of becoming undeniable no longer feels like salvation. And this is not because you have become detached from life. It is because life is beginning to ask for your presence rather than your performance. Presence may feel small at first. It may not resemble the old fire. It may not make you ambitious in the ways you used to understand. It may not immediately tell you what to do with your days. It may arrive as the ability to drink from a cup without turning the morning into a measure of worth. It may arrive as the feeling of walking through a hallway without rehearsing a defense. It may arrive as a pause before saying yes. It may arrive as a private tenderness toward the body that carried more than you ever admitted. The body may still be tired. Let it be tired without turning its tiredness into a verdict. For a long time, your body may have been asked to keep moving while the soul negotiated with old ghosts. It may have been praised for endurance while quietly recording the cost. It may have held the strain of every ambition that was secretly a plea, every act of service that hid a fear, every spiritual effort that tried to outrun grief. Now, when it refuses the old urgency, it may not be failing. It may be returning to the truth at the only pace it can trust. There is a gentler kind of movement that may come later, but it cannot be forced into being by the same methods that created the old exhaustion. It does not respond well to shame. It does not rise for comparison. It does not come alive when threatened with irrelevance. It is not the fire of proving. It is more like a small flame protected from wind, modest, steady, easily missed by anyone who only recognizes burning. This flame may care about fewer things, but what it cares about, it may care about with more honesty. You may not know yet what those things are. That uncertainty can feel like standing before a window at dawn, when the room is still dim and the outer shapes have not fully returned. You can see enough to know night is changing, but not enough to name the landscape. The old self may want to hurry this moment. It may want to make a plan out of it. A brand, a vow, a new identity. But the deeper self may ask for patience, not passive waiting, but reverent waiting, the kind that does not pull open the flower to prove it is alive. What has been buried for years does not always return with confidence. Desire may come back shyly, Joy may come back unevenly. Meaning may come back without drama. You may find yourself moved by something ordinary that the old motivation would have considered useless. A quiet meal, a slower walk, a conversation where you do not perform insight. A task done because it belongs to your real life, not because it proves your value. A silence that does not accuse you. These small moments may not look like awakening, but they may be closer to the self than the fevered striving ever was. The self, in Jungian language, does not always announce itself as greatness. Sometimes it appears as proportion. Things return to their proper size. Work becomes work. Not a courtroom where your worth is tried each morning. Love becomes love. Not a contract where you must keep earning your place. Spirituality becomes a way of listening, not a ladder by which you rise above your own humanity. Rest becomes rest, not a reward for perfect usefulness. The future becomes possible, not because it will finally save you, but because it no longer has to. This change can unsettle relationships around you, especially those that knew you primarily through your old motivation. If others were accustomed to your urgency, your overgiving, your constant availability, your need to prove, your ability to turn every wound into understanding, they may not know what to do with your quieter presence. They may ask where the old fire went. They may experience your new limits as distance. They may mistake your honesty for coldness. But you do not have to make your inner change sound acceptable to every ear that benefited from your former speed. Still, this is not a story of withdrawal from love. It is a story of love being separated from compulsion. You may love more truthfully when love is no longer fused with the need to be needed. You may work more cleanly when work is no longer carrying the burden of proving you deserve to exist. You may become spiritual in a humbler way when spirituality no longer protects you from grief. You may become gentler, not because you return to the old pleasing, but because the inner war around worth begins to quiet. There will be days when the old wound speaks again. It may say, "You are falling behind." It may say, "You are losing yourself." It may say, "No one will love you if you are not exceptional, useful, strong, or endlessly understanding." It may say that ordinary peace is failure. It may say that rest is laziness, that slowness is decline, that a quieter life means you have lost the very thing that made you special. When this voice returns, you do not need to obey it, and you do not need to hate it. You can recognize it as an old weather pattern moving through the house. The weather may pass more gently when it is known. You can sit by the window and hear the old rain without letting it flood every room. You can feel the ache of wanting to be seen without rebuilding your entire life around that ache. You can feel the fear of becoming less impressive without rushing to restore the persona. You can feel the grief of what was missing without trying to force the future to compensate for it. This is not mastery, it is relationship. The wounded parts of you are no longer rulers, but they are still guests who need to be received with dignity. Perhaps integration is nothing more glamorous than this. The ability to let more of yourself belong, the one who worked so hard, the one who lost motivation, the one who wanted to be admired, the one who wanted to disappear, the one who served, the one who resented serving, the one who believed in the old dream, the one who can no longer believe in it the same way. Instead of arranging them into a hierarchy of shame, the psyche begins to gather them around the same inner table, and no single part is asked to carry the whole name of you. This gathering may feel unfamiliar because your whole life depended on exclusion. Certain feelings had to be hidden so the role could continue. Certain needs had to be quiet so the image could remain intact. Certain doubts had to be dismissed so motivation would not falter. But now, the doubts have spoken, the needs have appeared, the tiredness has refused to disappear on command. The whole arrangement has opened, and what enters through that opening may not yet be happiness. It may be honesty. Sometimes honesty is the first mercy. You may begin to understand that the motivation behind your old life was not killed to leave you without direction. It was released because it belonged to an earlier form of you. It belonged to the self who needed pressure to feel safe, striving to feel worthy, recognition to feel real, distance from grief to keep functioning. That self had reasons, sacred reasons, in the private logic of pain, but the life ahead, whatever shape it takes, cannot be governed entirely by the fear that governed the life behind. This does not mean you will never strive again. It means striving may need to come from another ground, not from panic, not from the old inner audience, not from the wish to become so complete that no one can wound you, not from the need to turn yourself into evidence. Perhaps you will still work, create, love, build, serve, study, speak, begin again. But slowly, these movements may lose the taste of self-punishment. They may become offerings rather than bargains, expressions rather than defenses. There is a difference between a life that proves and a life that expresses. A proving life is always speaking to someone who is not fully listening. It gathers evidence. It performs in empty rooms. It asks the future to repair the past. An expressive life may still be imperfect, tired, uncertain, and unfinished. But it does not exist mainly as a petition. It lets what is real move outward because it is real, not because it must purchase safety. This difference may seem subtle, but the soul knows it immediately. You may feel that difference in small choices, choosing not to explain a quiet change before you understand it yourself. Choosing not to force enthusiasm where only obligation remains. Choosing not to turn every empty space into a new project. Choosing to let a day be simple without calling it wasted. Choosing to continue something old, but with a new honesty inside it. Choosing to leave something old, not to prove your freedom, but because your presence has already left it. These choices may not look grand, but they carry the weight of a life slowly returning from performance, and perhaps returning is the real word, not ascending, not becoming superior to the old world. Returning from the future you used as escape, returning from the persona that protected you too well, returning from the table where you waited to be named, returning from the mirror where you studied the self others could approve, returning from the hallway where you passed for so long between the room of the wound and the room of the living, returning to the body, to the ordinary breath, to the small truth that does not need to become impressive before it is allowed to exist. There may be sadness in returning. You may see the years differently. You may feel tenderness for the old self and sorrow for what was missed. You may realize that some doors closed while you were busy becoming acceptable. You may remember parts of yourself that did not get to grow in daylight. But even this sorrow can become less punishing when held with compassion. The lost years do not have to be turned into another accusation. They can become part of the truth, part of the texture, part of the long road by which the psyche found its way back to itself. No one can live without adaptation. The question is whether adaptation remains a servant or becomes a master. Your old life may have required a mask. It may have required discipline. It may have required silence, usefulness, striving, emotional management, spiritual meaning. These things are not evil, but when they become the whole of identity, the soul begins to starve behind them. Awakening did not come to humiliate the old self. It came because the soul could no longer live entirely through what once protected it. So let the old motivation be laid down gently, not thrown away, not cursed, laid down like a tool after long labor, like a coat worn through many winters, like a cup emptied at the end of a long night. You may still feel fondness for it. You may still fear what life will ask without it, but you do not need to keep drinking from the same cup simply because it once held warmth. There are forms of life that cannot enter until the hands are no longer closed around what has already served its time. Maybe the new motivation will not feel like motivation at all at first. Maybe it will feel like consent, a quiet yes that rises without pressure, a small movement towards something that does not insult your soul, a willingness to care without disappearing, a willingness to work without becoming a verdict, a willingness to love without turning yourself into the price of being loved, a willingness to remain in your own life without making every moment prove that the old wound was wrong. This quieter yes may not impress the old inner audience. It may not satisfy the part of you that still wants a dramatic rebirth. It may not look powerful, but it may be more faithful to the truth than all the old fire, because it does not ask you to abandon yourself in order to move. It does not ask you to become exceptional before being allowed to breathe. It does not ask you to transform every sadness into meaning before you have had time to feel it. It lets life begin closer to where you actually are. The house is still here, the window is still here, the chair is still here, but their meanings have changed. The house is no longer only the place where the wound arranged your future. The window is no longer only the surface where you watched for a life that would finally redeem the past. The chair is no longer only the seat of waiting, proving, and exhaustion. It can become a place where the one who tried so hard is allowed to sit without being asked for anything more. And perhaps that is enough for now. Not an ending that solves everything. Not a promise that the ache will never return. Not a grand doorway into certainty. Just this. The old command has weakened. The old bargain has been seen. The old wound no longer moves through your life completely unnamed. Something in you can pause before obeying. Something in you can feel the difference between fear and truth. Something in you has begun to belong to itself, even if only in small, fragile moments. This is not less than awakening. This may be the part of awakening that becomes livable, not the bright idea of transformation, but the quiet human fact that you no longer have to turn your whole life into compensation. You can let certain ambitions become ordinary. You can let certain roles become partial. You can let certain griefs remain griefs without forcing them to become instructions. You can let the old self be honored without allowing it to keep answering for the whole soul. There may still be caring, there may still be effort, there may still be days when the old fear returns and sits beside you like a familiar shadow. But now, perhaps, it does not sit on the throne. It does not name every desire. It does not turn every silence into failure. It does not own every room. And when you look toward the window, you may not yet see a new life fully formed, but you may see enough to know that the old one is no longer the only possible shape of you. The old wound stopped ruling the life it once kept moving.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.